Alright folks, let's talk about canines. You know that feeling you get when you see a rabbit or a deer or a cow walking by and you just get this insatiable urge to pounce on it and subdue it with your mighty claws and rip into its neck with these fierce specimens. And then all of the discomfort and illness that confounds you when you realize that you don't actually have the enzymes that you need to digest raw meat, and the fatigue and the delirium that sets in when you realize that meat has none of the carbohydrates or fibers or vitamins that your brain and body need to thrive. Gosh, what could be more natural than that? So while it might be kind of fun to dig into the anthropology of all of that, and while I did receive an unsurprising number of comments about canines in the comments of my last video, I will not be addressing that today. There are plenty of people who have talked about that. There are plenty of people who have gone over the healthfulness, the science of the healthfulness of a whole foods plant-based diet, so I'm not going to be touching that today. But I am going to be answering some of the good faith questions that I got on my last video. How to go vegan on a working class budget or as somebody who occasionally experiences food insecurity. What other things we can be doing to fight for animal liberation and total liberation. Why veganism is always political. It's never not political. Never. And then 2 more questions that I got from non-vegans in good faith. What about plant sentience? And where do all the animals go if we go vegan and we're not eating them anymore? Number 1, how to go vegan on a working class budget or as somebody who sometimes experiences food insecurity. Often when people think about veganism, they tend to equate it to just a plant-based diet, but there is obviously so much more to it than that. There are obviously so many other industries that harm and abuse animals, like the leather industry, like cosmetics with animal testing, which is just absolutely grotesque. There are also a lot of animals used and abused for the purpose of entertainment, which is similarly grotesque. And as I talked about in my last video, we cannot just stop at changing our diets, we cannot just stop at our consumption. There are much broader systems that we also need to dismantle if we want to actually see animal liberation. But I'm going to start with how to eat plant-based on a working class budget or as somebody who sometimes experiences food insecurity. There are a number of people like Sweet Potato Soul and Cheap Lazy Vegan who post about how to do cheap vegan meal prep. Staples like rice, beans, pasta, etc. are all generally affordable, so you can just do a quick Google search for ways to go vegan on the cheap and you will find loads. Often the issue for people is time, however, which is hard to get around, and also access for people living in food deserts or on food stamps, etc. So I will point you to a book by baby mama Rachel, aka Rachel Bolden Kramer, who wrote a book called My Food Stamps Cookbook, which is a resource for people who want to eat more plant-based on food stamps. And I googled this and there are a number of other resources as well on tips and tricks on how to go vegan on food stamps. Tennessee Food Stamps recommends buying more unperishables such as whole grains, pasta, rice, oats, wheat, barley, cereals, quinoa, nuts, beans, lentils, and nut butters. Canned or frozen fruit are also great and last a long time. I personally buy a lot of frozen fruit myself. Jarred sauces such as tomato sauce and paste can also be relatively cheap and can last a long time. Buying these non-perishable items in bulk and storing them is a great way to reduce costs. And for people who are wondering about protein, etc., if you just eat a variety of whole plant foods, you're going to be eating enough protein. People are worried about complete proteins, and you really don't have to be worried about that. But for anyone who is worried, if you just combine one grain and one legume like rice or beans, or even just, wheat like bread and peanut butter, then you're getting complete proteins. But of course, changing ourselves and changing our consumption habits to match our political ideology is only step 1, and there are many other things that we can and should be doing to contribute to broader animal liberation. And of course, if you can't consume 100% perfectly all the time, there are other things that you can and should be doing to fight for animal liberation as part of a bid for total liberation. And of course, what we all can do is going to be time dependent. If you're someone who is working 2 to 3 jobs, whatnot, you may not have time to do much more than just consume. And that's okay. I'm going to be talking later about why veganism is always political. It's never not political. But if you do have little time, there are still things that you can do. You can educate, you can share information online, you can talk to your friends and family about this. You can take time to read some of the resources that I put in the description box of my last video and learn about the interconnection of animal liberation and human liberation and bring that to light as much as possible in whatever activism that you do. A lot of people will call this slacktivism, but you can sign petitions, you can write to your representatives. Recently in Canada, we actually banned whale and dolphin captivity, which is amazing. So there are so many campaigns like this going on all the time that you can lend your support to, you can lend your voice to. If you do have money, you can donate to. In terms of putting pressure on politicians or representatives, how about pushing to end the billions of dollars in subsidies that we pour into animal agriculture so that the price of meat and processed meat, which is a class 1 carcinogen, by the way, is artificially low, and we're just flooded with this stuff. I mean, all of that could be channeled towards food justice initiatives and programs that make sure that everyone, no matter what your income, is able to access healthy, affordable food. And if you do have more time and capacity, then educate, agitate, organize. I mentioned Collectively Free in the last video, and they're an example of a great organization that's making connections between animal liberation and human liberation and doing direct action. And animal rights activists, especially those who understand the connection between animal oppression and all other oppression, should be showing up in solidarity with other movements and making those links clear between animal liberation and human liberation. Like, we should be showing up at all of the environmental movements like Extinction Rebellion, etc., and demonstrating with signs or whatnot, or just talking to people about the links between the oppression of animals and climate change, the oppression of the environment. And of course, linking this all very clearly with the capitalist political economic system that is driving all of this destruction. Collectively Free, again, is making great connections between LGBTQ liberation and animal liberation. There are activists out there making connections between BLM and animal liberation, or anti-racist work and animal liberation. There are activists out there making connections between disability justice and animal liberation. So depending on your own positionality, there are a lot of ways that you can get involved to really make connections between these movements and build greater solidarity and momentum. There's also the Food Empowerment Project run by Lauren Ornelas, who is amazing, and they do so much great work fighting for farm workers across the board, the rights of farm workers, the wages of farm workers. They fight to address issues like food deserts, so addressing people who can't access healthy, affordable, plant-based food. And they have a great chocolate list that I mentioned last time, so where's your chocolate coming from? Even if you're a vegan, it doesn't mean you're cruelty-free. So inspired by that, fight for workers, fight for farm workers, fight for all workers, fight for worker control of the means of production and the means of subsistence and feeding ourselves. Join a radical political organization near you, unionize, build community, support co-ops, support organizations that have alternative ways of procuring and provisioning food, such as Food Not Bombs, which does dumpster diving, which procures food in non-commodified ways and then cooks it up and shares it freely to the public, along with information about the broader political systems that we're living under and what we all need to do to come together and make change. Fight austerity at every turn. Get out there, educate, agitate, organize. I mean, there's so many things that we can be doing, that we should be doing, that we need to be doing if we're ever going to see animal liberation or human liberation. And we all have our own skills, we all have our own limitations. I would say I'm a better educator, perhaps agitator, than I am an organizer, and that's just my skill set, so that's fine. We all have limitations, but together, the people united will never be defeated. And so this kind of feeds into some of the pushback I was getting on the last video. Well, it was actually basically just one person who had commented about 150 times about how dare I try to politicize veganism. Veganism is apolitical. It is an apolitical ethical stance that anyone can adopt regardless of their other ethical frameworks, regardless of what other harm they perpetuate in their lives, regardless if they're a free market fundamentalist and the policies that they're pushing are actively driving this whole process, actively driving speciesism and the destruction of the planet and the oppression of animals. No matter. We don't have to think about any of those contradictions. No. It's just totally disconnected from any other system. So first of all, as I've shown, I think that is simply not the case. And secondly, veganism is always political. It is always political. It is never not political. You are asking people to care about a group of marginalized beings that they have no other reason to care about. In fact, they benefit personally from the oppression of that group of beings. You are withholding your dollar because you think that that is a political statement that is politically harming corporations and governments that benefit from the systemic oppression of animals. So if you are doing that at the same time that you are promoting and upholding a global economic system that empowers those same corporations and governments, capitalist governments, then what are you doing? Are you simply avoiding buying animal products because to you, as an ethical stance, that makes you a moral person? You're just doing it for yourself and you don't really care if these broader systems are perpetuated? Because that's so contradictory. It makes little sense to me. I mean, I showed in my last video that so many of the products that people are buying as vegans to avoid buying animal products are just owned by larger non-vegan conglomerates or just non-vegan companies themselves. Like Alpro is owned by Danone, the largest dairy producer in the world. Field Roast is owned by Maple Leaf Foods, Maple Leaf Meats, basically. Does that sound like animal liberation to you? Because it doesn't sound like animal liberation to me. And people were saying that the reason that meat production has grown so much is because of a growing population and a growing middle class in certain emerging economies like China, which are now able to buy more meat, which is true. However, per capita meat consumption has grown 20 kilograms since 1961. And this increase means that total meat production has been growing at a much faster rate than population growth. And people were saying, oh no, all of that consumption is just happening in China and in North America, meat consumption is dropping, meat production is dropping, which is not true. It dipped slightly in the mid-2000s and then it's back on the rise again. The only thing that's happening is that the type of meat that people are eating are changing. So people are eating less beef in North America, but they're eating so many more chickens. Chicken production has just increased. So, yes, meat production and consumption would be way higher if there weren't so many vegans. And so I do think it is important, like I talked about in the last video, I do think it is important to consume vegan as much as is possible and practicable and to inform people about all of this. But this doesn't sound like animal liberation. And even if we were reducing the number of animals who were in this horrible system, I mean, my goal is not reducing, my goal is smashing the systems, right? I mean, obviously there's a difference between having 1 million animals slaughtered or 100 animals slaughtered. That is a big difference. But to me, in another sense, there isn't much of a difference. And even if there's one animal in that system, that's too many. And they shouldn't be there. We need to smash that system, right? And I also wanted to say that, as I mentioned before, not all of us have the time to go out and do all this activism and work on smashing those systems really in a participatory way. But there are a lot of other things that we can do. And I would say that even just consuming vegan is always political in itself, right? I mean, how many times have you just been out somewhere eating your vegan meal quietly, not saying anything? People will notice that there's no meat. Oh, hey, where's the meat? And then all of a sudden you're in a conversation about animal lives and ethics and the environment and all of this stuff. It is never not political. I mean, just making that choice and being visible is political in the sense that you're opening up discussion in order to change hearts and minds and to open people up to the idea of animal liberation. I mean, that is political in itself. Spreading this information, educating, that's the step. Educate, agitate, organize. So it's just, I think it's ridiculous to say that this is disconnected from politics. It's never disconnected from politics, and it's not happening in a vacuum. Veganism or animal liberation is not happening in a vacuum, and we have to look at these broader systems that we're operating within. There's just, I don't see how you could argue the opposite. Okay, so now we get to the last two questions, which were actual good faith questions that I got from non-vegans in the comments about plant sentience and about where do all the animals go when we're not eating them anymore. If you really, really are concerned about plant sentience and feel upset about harming plants, That would make this a good faith question. Most people ask this question just as a way to disregard animal rights, or just as a way to just legitimate what they're doing. Well, oh, if plants can feel pain, or if plants have sentience, and therefore I don't have to think about this other group. It's just a way of discounting all of this and excusing oppressing animals. But if you really are concerned about plant sentience, I will offer you this. The majority of fruits and vegetables that you consume do not kill the plant. You don't have to kill the plant to harvest those things, right? So you think about tomatoes on a vine. They grow. If nobody picks them, eventually they will just fall off the vine and they will rot on the ground. The plant is still living. The plant is fine. So there's no reason to not consume the products that come from those plants. But if you really are concerned about harming plants, then it makes even less sense to consume animals, because the amount of plants and crops, etc., that must be fed to those animals before you can then eat that animal, and additional crops, presumably, unless you're Jordan B. Peterson, additional crops that you need to furnish the rest of what your body needs to function, then you're actually requiring the consumption of so many exponentially more crops to do that. 70% of the grains grown in the United States are fed to livestock. And same with the soy and the corn, etc. So if you want to cut down on people eating crops, it would make the most sense to cut out the middleman, just cut out animal agriculture. That would still make the most sense. But as I said, you don't have to kill the plants to harvest a lot of their fruits or vegetables or other things. So hopefully that answered that question. And lastly, where do all these animals go? Where do these billions of animals go now that we're not eating them? Well, unfortunately, and I'm sorry to say this for vegans who are watching this, all of the animals, pretty much all of them that are in the system right now, are going to die. They are going to be killed. The way this works, it's not as though one year we see a drop in demand for meat, and so these big ag companies are like, oh, we're seeing a slightly lower demand this year. Okay, let's just release about 20 cows and send them into some sanctuaries. That's not how this works. They will slaughter all of the animals that they have, unless they are miraculously saved or they escape, or there's a lot of different reasons why animals can get out of the animal agriculture industry. But by and large, companies aren't, crunching the numbers and then releasing animals that they aren't using. Basically, most of those animals, if not all of those animals, will be killed, and they will find a use for them. They will find some use for them, whether it be pet food, whether it be whatever, whether they try to go into new markets around the world and open them up and undercut the local food systems, like McDonald's, etc., will go into different countries and just undercut the local food system so that everyone ends up reliant on their food. Things like that. So not everyone's going to be going vegan overnight. This is going to be a transition period, right? And if enough people are going vegan and putting pressure on these industries and putting pressure on our representatives and our governments to not subsidize them, and creating programs where farmers can start to transition away from animal agriculture into other professions or other kinds of farming or whatnot, this is going to be a transition. It's not going to be everyone goes vegan overnight and then, oops, we have billions of land animals that have nowhere to go. That's just not a situation that's going to happen. So by the time we're done with this transition, I'm sure that there still will be, I guess you could say, domesticated animals or animals that we have reciprocal relationships with that are kind of outside of commodity relationships, etc. We've made a podcast about this, actually, about kind of the fate of domestic animals if people are interested. But this isn't going to be a situation where we just all of a sudden have billions of land animals we don't know what to do with. So hopefully that answers that question as well. So as always, thanks for watching, everyone. And the value extraction portion, if you would like to support the continuation of these videos, tossing me even $1 per month via Patreon goes a really long way. Thanks to Will Jarvis for doing the music for this video. Special thanks to my existing patrons now, and super special thanks to Magurix, Anarcho Drinking Beerism, and Ranger Jenny. Check out my podcast at veganvanguardpodcast.com. Connect with me on Twitter and Facebook. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in another video.